Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 32, Episode 8. Coming up on the show, we've got the psychic snow factor, the giant talking cat versus the pervert, and the Japanese brain blaster. I'm your host, Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wrights. You like that one? He likes that one. He likes the talking cat versus the pervert. Look, I've even got a picture of it. I'll show you. It's got artwork.
What the hell is...
There you go, see? The giant talking cat and the pervert. It's two children in the forest. There's a giant cat.
It's a pervert at the bottom right-hand
And there's some perv peeking out behind the bushes. Real story.
I wasn't ready for this because we were talking just before the show and you were like, okay, this is going to be a fun show. It's much lighter. We've been really dark recently in a couple of the episodes we've done. It's going to be really light. And then you hit me with a psychic cat.
It's one of the lead stories from this new book from Richard Freeman from the CFZ out of the UK, the Centre for Fortean Zoology. This is the highest strangeness.
I really like him. Aside from he's a good researcher, he's just got that kind of like almost, he's not befuddled, it's an endearing way, but of like the old British kind of way about him, about just getting into these topics. And he really gets himself amongst the weeds. So this is going to be exciting.
Well, the great thing about the highest strangeness, packed with stories, and many of them are the classics that we've covered over the years.
Sure.
And this is coming in at 400 and something pages.
Yeah, it looks reasonably
410 pages.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Full of perverted cat stories.
Well, so it's full of little stories that we've never covered before, which is rare. I mean, It's hard to find that these days. And full of personal experiences. So one of them, which I'll tell later on in the Plus extension later on in the show, he, when he was at university, he was a goth, big goth on the goth scene in the UK. And to celebrate his 10 years of being a goth, he held...
Wait. People celebrate a decade of being a goth?
Apparently back then, this was in the 80s or something, right? And he said he wanted to throw this big party at their university. And there's this basement that was basically, no one used it for anything. It's just this dark, dank, moldy basement.
So lots of black crepe paper, no doubt.
Well, he decided to, inspired by a horror novel, to create an altar to a spider god in this basement. And center this goth party around this spider god. So we had a big, plush, fluffy spider that was activated by noise and it would kind of go up and down. And he had red pentagrams. It was all kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of, a little bit silly. It's a silly party. And
so he wasn't, genuinely setting up some altar to worship or anything like that?
Well, not at first, because they had this goth party. It was a lot of fun. Everyone got drunk and it was fun. But then afterwards, he was cleaning up and he looked at this giant spider god altar and he thought, I don't really want to take this down. Maybe in my last couple of months here at the university, I'll try some thought experiments. Maybe I'll try a few tulpa experiments.
Okay. This is what I was talking about getting amongst the weeds. No one ever thinks, I'll just try a few tulpa experiments and it'll be fine.
So he starts sending his mental energy into this big fluffy toy spider, picturing this god, and I'll recall the author's name, the horror author that created this fictional spider god in the show later on, but he describes sending all his energy into this giant fluffy spider, and after a while he would go down into that basement and he would see this little thing crawl across, this huge white thing crawl across the wall, almost like it was burnt into his retina. So anyway, long story short, I'll get to all the details coming up, but he ends up leaving university, but while he's away, he takes 2 weeks off, he goes somewhere, and when he comes back, he starts hearing about all these reports of giant spiders, not at the university, but just in Leeds in the UK in general.
Really?
All these people are reporting giant spiders in their homes. The pest control companies just run off their feet. And remember that TV show Mandy, where one of the first episodes she works at the banana factory?
Yeah.
That's based on a real story. It's this funny UK show where she works at a banana factory and her only job is to smash the giant tarantulas with a hammer.
Yeah, it's Diane Morgan, isn't it?
Yeah, but she's hopeless.
She's hopeless. That's the whole premise of the show. She's completely hopeless.
A bunch of people die because they're bitten by giant tarantulas. That really happened in Leeds. At the same time he was creating the spider tulpa, this banana factory had all these Brazilian huntsman spiders leap out of the boxes. One of the workers got bitten on the face and sued This was all following his spider tulpa experiments.
This is incredible because I remember Nick Redfern has just kind of told us the surface of this story, but he's never gone into anything to do with actual outbreaks of spiders or people outside that circle actually seeing, were people actually seeing like tulpic manifestations? Is that what they were experiencing?
Well, no, the pest control guys were actually catching
They were
giant
real.
spiders, and they were just your typical local species.
But not local to that particular area.
No, they were local to that area. They were just the normal spiders from that area, but they were abnormally large, and there was a lot of them. They were just everywhere. So he's like, was it a coincidence that I just started these tulpa thought experiments of this spider god, and then this broke out, all these spiders broke out, and a banana factory burnt down from Brazilian spiders?
A decade ago, I would have said, absolutely, it's a coincidence. Now I'm like, absolutely, it's a tulpic energy field that's been generated and it's creating weird spiders, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to getting into that later in the show. Yeah, we definitely need to go a little bit lighter, but funnily enough, I'm jumping off the last book we were talking about. So if you recall, we were talking about Ursula, is it Bielski's?
Bielski's. Ursula Bielik?
Bielik, that's it. Ursula Bielik's book, where she was coming from, essentially it was a very much caught up in what would be ghost hunting, and she realized that there are inherent dangers in doing ghost hunting, and that kind of then started to collide with her Catholicism later on, and essentially everything is demons. Like, everything is demons.
No, we should clarify, like, people in the comments are being going, well, who's saying everything? If you say everything is demons, that's ridiculous. But no one's actually saying
No, that's just part of that joke.
There's a difference between saying something is a demon and saying the activity is demonic.
Yes, absolutely, right? There is, yeah.
And that was a claim, though, that much of the UFO phenomenon in particular is very much tied in with the demonic.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think as well, there was an element that came up in some of her stories of being a ghost hunter or a ghost investigator. I shouldn't say hunter. She was a ghost investigator. But she would go out to these locations. She would go to these sites to try and see, what was going on, make recordings. And there was this factor that came up, which was consistent with what today we would call the hitchhiker phenomenon, where people bring the phenomenon home with them. But she was kind of more talking along the lines of people bringing ghosts home with them. It's like they would have a ghost that would move to certain locations. But this is something that has been identified by Brad Steiger, the legendary researcher and author who's published over 180 books, something in that range. So don't quote me on that, but a huge amount of books. Sadly, he's not with us anymore, but he recognized this back in the 70s, that there was this weird, I guess, transference factor of where these ghosts would follow you home. And then, of course, if you start digging around the internet, Reddit of all places, you find people that are quite open about their experiences. And there was this one small case that I kind of found that really highlighted this and made me dig deeper into Brad's research, because people were questioning this, well, have you ever had a spooky experience? And this one young guy said that, oh, yeah, I've had it. And this is obviously anecdotal, but he says, yeah, I've had this really weird experience. I was living in this house and there was weird activity going on in the house, but I never saw anything. And on one particular evening, his girlfriend was babysitting some 6-year-old or 7-year-old. And so the girlfriend had said to him, come over to the house that I'm babysitting at and, we'll just watch a couple of movies because I've got to be here until midnight or whatever it was. He's like, yeah, okay, cool. So he leaves and he goes over to this house where his girlfriend is, and the night is reasonably uneventful. The kid is reasonably well behaved, nothing happens until all of a sudden the kid keeps on getting up in the middle of the night, but just keeps on getting up. They put him to bed around, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and he keeps on getting up. And they're like, why do you keep on getting up? Why are you doing this? And apparently the girlfriend had babysat him many times before and he never displayed this kind of behavior. And he's like, she won't leave me alone. She keeps on bugging me. Now, he's got nothing to do with it. He's only just met this kid, so he's not going upstairs. And she goes upstairs and she calms this young boy down and gets him to go back to sleep. And he keeps on insisting. He's like, she's back. And eventually everything goes quiet. And the girlfriend goes upstairs to check on this boy again because she can hear whispering. And she can hear the kid saying, oh, yeah, oh, no, don't do that. Oh, don't scratch me. Oh, yeah, oh, and just like these weird mutterings from this boy. But where she flips out is she then hears the voice of a young girl. Well, it sounds to be like a young girl. She can't make out what it is, but she hears another voice in response to the boy.
There's someone else in the room.
Well, of course, that's what she thinks. And she's like, and because the kid's been saying all evening, she's been keeping me awake. She slams the door open. She goes running into the room, obviously flicks the light on. And the kid's just there very not distressed and looking at her like, what are you doing in here? And she said, who were you talking to? You know, who's in the house? And this kid's like, oh, it's the girl I told you about. She keeps on bothering me. And apparently, right, I'm laughing about the fact about just how there's this really strange validation that comes through, because she takes the boy downstairs because she's freaked out. Like, she doesn't want to talk to him. She doesn't want to talk to him, but she's freaked about the situation and she wants to talk to him about it in front of the boyfriend. And so she brings him downstairs and says, who is this girl? She's like, I've never met this girl before. I've never met her. She's got burns. Like, she's got burns on her and she's upset. And but she came with him. And he just points. This young boy points over to the eyewitness in this report. And he's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this is just crazy. And he's like, she came with you. I saw her walk through the front door with you. And he's just taken aback because obviously there's no young girl. He didn't bring a young girl along. Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, she's about my height. She's young, long blonde hair, but she's got these burns on her. Now we find out later on, and of course, this is just according to the eyewitness, so we don't know exactly. But we find out later on that next door, there was a house fire where a young girl had perished many decades before. So it wasn't even in his house, but somehow being in proximity to this thing, he had brought a ghost with him without indulging in any type of paranormal activity. He insists that he wasn't, doing a Ouija boards or drugs or any of those normal factors that induce this kind of spirit attachment, which can sometimes occur. It's just basically, it seems like if you break it down into its very rudimentary kind of form, he came over to his girlfriend's place and brought this ghost girl with him who was hanging out with this kid upstairs. I'm like, that's crazy. Like, that's absolutely crazy. But there are so many of these similar reports, right? So then there was another example of where someone kind of tuned in and said something along the lines of, oh, yeah, like I would always go and hang out on this farm. And this farm was owned by my cousin's friends or something, but we'd always go and spend our summers there. And for whatever reason, I don't know exactly where it was, but there was a tornado that was coming in. So it must be somewhere in the Plain States, Kansas maybe. But he said this man showed up, and this man, like just a kind man, but he seemed like elderly, and he comes along to this kid who must have been 11, 12 years old. And he's like, Sonny, you better get inside. There's a terrible storm coming. And he was like, oh, no, like, it's fine. Like, he actually argued with this man. And he said, no, it's fine. He's like, no, you better get inside now. And he just felt off about it, that he's like, okay. So he went inside and he pulled everyone else inside and starts talking to the family and to his friends, his friends' parents. And like, what are you talking about? There's no one in miles. Who was this man? Who are you describing? And they couldn't identify him. They had no idea who this guy was. Next second, tornado comes in just suddenly. And that misses their house and they're fine, but tears through their property, rages for God knows how long, and then abruptly finishes.
There's a bunch of stories similar to that in Richard Freeman's book, but he has them in the category of children with imaginary friends.
Yes, they're also known as, I was looking at this today, they're also known, it's a new term in psychology for them called invisible companions.
Yeah, there was that book that came out of Invisikids.
That's right, yes.
Was it like 4 or 5 years ago now?
Yep.
And it was the first academic look at children that have these memories. One of them was a young boy who, I think it was his father's study or an old room in the house, and they had this antique wardrobe and very old, dark oak. And he said whenever he would go into that room and look at that wardrobe, a conquistador would appear in front of it.
Oh, so it's like attached to the...
Yeah, like a Spanish guy with shiny armor. And it was always very kind to him, very friendly, and it would give him advice. Like, it would give him advice about things going on in his life. Like, once he was quite sad that his grandmother had passed away, and this conquistador appears. And he's like, what's wrong? Why are you upset? He says, I'm sad that my grandma's disappeared. And what he tells him is, if you watch the clock, the pain will go. Like some kind of cryptic version of that. I mean, when he was remembering this, he was like 8 or 9 years old. But he took it literally and sat on a chair and watched the clock. Like, obviously the message is time heals all wounds.
Yes,
But
yeah.
he sat down and started staring at the clock. And he said it actually helped. He got over, the grief. But also things like, if he was accused of something at school that he didn't do, this knight would show up, or not a knight, a conquistador would show up and say, like little kind of cryptic lines like, those who tell lies, don't worry, those lies will turn around and spear them. And it ends up making him feel better, and in the end, he learns a lesson.
But with all these strange kind of profound morals that he's teaching this kid, and it's guiding him in life. It's just strange.
Well, another one was a young girl who her imaginary friend was Elvis. And like Elvis before he died, like wearing the white suit with, fat and the glasses and everything. And she would dance with him in the backyard, and the grandmother would see her like spinning around as if she was dancing with someone. And the neighbors would ask like, who's Elvis? She's always talking to Elvis. Is that your cat? And the grandmother would go, no, it's her imaginary friend. Anyway, the weird thing about it was she had no idea who Elvis was. She'd never seen Elvis. No one in the family was interested in Elvis. They didn't have any Elvis memorabilia. Like no one listened to Elvis. And years later, this is after Elvis died, he was on a television show and she was watching it. And she says to her parents, that guy looks just like Elvis. And she's not referring to Elvis, the legendary rock star. She's referring to her imaginary friend. She's like, that guy on TV looks like my imaginary friend Elvis.
Isn't that strange? See, from a skeptical standpoint, people would say, oh, well, young children incorporate images that they see in the media and on TV, and it kind of manifests in these forms. But I think it's more than that, especially when people like what you described there, she had kind of this outwards reaction of, hey, what's my invisible friend doing there?
Yeah, she had no idea. She claimed she had no idea who Elvis was in any like relation to real life.
Well, it's funny as well, because as I was digging into that kind of stuff, I would just kind of brush the top of it because I didn't really want to go into invisible companions too much. But I did find this element that kind of showed up, which is consistent with something we've been talking about recently. And that's this initiatory experience. And with this research, the academic and psychological, mainstream research into invisible friends, and there's plenty of it out there actually, there seems to be this trend, funnily enough, that if a person has had an invisible friend when they're younger, like actually, and not just an invisible friend where a kid will kind of just play in the backyard for a couple of days or even a few hours and be like, oh yeah, I was just my friend that they've made up. No, this is actually that they've truly believe that they're interacting with some type of form. The parents will often report that objects will move in ways that they're not sure about. Some of the really scary cases of where the child will get into locations that the child shouldn't be able to access. Sure. There's no rational understanding of how they got there. And when they ask the child's response will be, oh, Uncle Danny over there helped me up, or Elvis picked me up and put me up, those sorts of things. But what they noticed in this research is that people that have invisible friends and invisible companions when they're younger, they're significantly more likely to have trance-like experiences and psychic experiences when they're older.
Okay.
And veridical experiences that they're able to verify or validate to a point. They can't reproduce it in a laboratory, obviously, and like none of this ever has been able to be done so. But they do notice this effect. So I'm like, I was just thinking, is this more like of a initiatory contact experience that they have when they're young, which opens them up to the world of this phenomena?
I think, to put it simply, some kids are just seeing spirits and interacting with spirits.
Yeah, that's but that's something that both Ingo Swann and Brad Steiger recognized Brad Steiger recognized from a very early age, and I'll go into his early age experience in a moment. But where all of this, really started was that I just happened to be listening to this Ingo Swann presentation from a conference he attended in 2006. And, he's very well spoken and obviously quite deep in these metaphysical topics, of course. And, we've, made some jokes in the past about some of his remote viewing experiences, particularly from his book Penetration, seeing naked men mining on the moon, this kind of stuff, which is funny and ridiculous in itself. But as you start, looking into his other experiences, you realize that he was definitely onto something, because what he noticed in his research, for many, many years, is if you look into Sanskrit, for example, in our modern terms, we don't have any way really to identify this phenomena. We're trying, we're just talking about, the academic research into invisible companions. That's one subset of, I guess you could call it, superhuman abilities or supernatural research that is occurring to a degree. But we really don't have any materialistic scientific way of defining what this stuff is and what the experiences people have. Yet if you look into Sanskrit, those times, he said these concepts have been around for thousands of years. And in fact, it goes back as far as 300,000 years ago when life was tough on the human body. And as a result, we developed these life-saving intuitions. And he says there are sutras that actually stimulate or awaken spontaneous intuition that functions without conscious reasoning. And I'm like, okay, well that, obviously it's a long way of saying it essentially that you have like a sixth sense. We have an innate sixth sense, and this is something that was recognized a long time ago. But there may be an evolutionary reason as to why we have this, why we can access these sorts of things. And it's not just telepathy. It also can be things like the third man effect, which came up. So he tells this story. He says, look, there's this story I know of a man who was holidaying in the mountains. And when he goes into the mountains, it was snowy, but not treacherous. There was a little bit of a storm kind of brewing, I believe, but nothing that was terrible. And the guy heads out and he was just loving it. He was in a solitary kind of location. It's very meditative and relaxing. And he's going along and he says he's looking at the scenery when all of a sudden he realizes that his body had stopped. It was the most peculiar and remarkable at the same time of sensations, because his body had stopped, but he hadn't. And what he meant by that is as his body had stopped and his second body or his spirit body had continued to walk out of his body.
Okay. Now, what happened with his actual physical body to just
he turns
crumple
around.
On the ground?
No. He says he turns around to look at himself and he can see himself. And as he's looking, he says he sees that his knees are starting to go weak and the physical form is actually seemingly under some kind of control as it starts taking 3 steps backwards. Now, the spirit body, the spirit form of this man is like looking around trying to assess his situation when he realizes that he's no longer standing on flat surface. He's standing over the edge of a sheer cliff.
What the hell?
Like he's over the edge of a sheer cliff. Now, what had happened is that he looked down expecting to see a mangled corpse, as you would expect, and he finds nothing. He looks back up. It's his body moving backwards. Now, he says he's suddenly taken back into his body moving backwards. He runs off back to his lodge and consumes 6 martinis, and that's the end of experience. Now, Ingo Swan points out, he says, this is definitely something that you cannot bring into a lab. You can't replicate this in a lab. And, him having alcohol after this, you couldn't blame him for having 6 martinis after such a shocking experience. But what this sounds like in a roundabout way is a form of the third man factor. Now, of course, with the third man factor, there should have to be a third party there that had intervened and had saved him. There isn't necessarily that. So this is kind of a first man factor. But it ties back into these sutras that he was talking about, these evolved superhuman abilities that we have that no longer are recognized by mainstream science, by modern science, but they function without conscious reasoning. He says it overrides your motor cortex to stop the body and then force it to move back. It sensed danger because you were too foolish to recognize that danger. And that's exactly what happened with this guy. So it's like, if the guy just simply, and of course people could go, look, he had a near-death experience, not in the sense that we talk about in the supernatural sense. He just came close to going over the edge of the cliff. It all happened in the spur of a moment. He managed to throw himself backwards and somehow he's manifested or hallucinated this whole experience. But Swan insists that that's not the case here. What the case is here is that his motor cortex shut down and took over his body through some innate, intervention and saved his body, and his spirit body just came back to it. And I think that, as crazy as that sounds, I've heard that before.
Yeah, I think the issue I have with this is the concept that there's just one aspect of us. There's our soul and that's it. There's our soul and our body and that's it. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like you've got the daemon, for example. You've got the assistant spirit. You've got all sorts of other potential sentient consciousness.
Yes.
That is part of our being.
Well, I mean,
I think it's too narrow to say that we are this soul and a body. Some people don't even go that far. They just say we're a brain and a body.
But that's from a scientific standpoint where we are right now. And things will change, right? Things I think will change as we start to recognize these sorts of things. It's going to take time, but that's where we are right now. And of course, this was back in 2006 that he was talking about this. When I'm saying things change, well, I'm sorry, but the wheels move very slowly. It's very slow. There may be a flywheel effect that kind of kicks in as more of this research starts coming on board. People become less focused on the taboo of these things. It might be, people be more open to it. I don't see that happening for the moment, but I think in the meantime, we just have these anecdotes of these experiences to guide us and to give us some understanding of what potentially is happening here. And so he says, look, this kind of stuff, it's like, if you try to put a scientific spin on it, you kind of can, because he talks about parasitia. And parasitia is essentially this old Sanskrit discussion about the knowledge of other people's mental images. which is now known as mind reading. Like, this is mind reading. And he points out that, look, there was actually an article that was published in the New York Times on the 10th of January back in the early 2000s. I didn't write down the date, I'm sorry. But it references research from Italian scientists in 1996. That's what's important. And these scientists, these neuroscientists, were doing work with the prefrontal cortex of macaque monkeys, right, which are generally used in this sort of research. And he said there was something that was strange that was recognized by this, is that when these macaque monkeys looked at each other, they somehow demonstrated, because obviously their brain patterns were being monitored, their frontal cortexes demonstrated the identical or parallel lighting up of the firing patterns in that motor cortex, or the prefrontal cortex, or premotor cortex. And in doing so, it suggested that these monkeys were reading minds. And that's what the title of the article was. The title of the article was Cells That Read Minds, Mind-Reading Monkeys. And this was strange because they noticed that there was some type of transference of a intuition or a feeling or an emotion from one subject monkey to the next subject monkey. And he says, if this is happening in monkeys, it's suggesting that this ability may also be in human beings. And this may give us some insight. It may not be the answer, of course, but it may give us some insight into why humans can unconsciously detect the intentions of others and respond in potentially hostile or dangerous environments that pose a threat to that human being. And that's a good example. That's a good thing, right? There's plenty of examples where I think we've all experienced this, right? Where, if you walk down, it's late at night and you walk down a dark, deserted street, immediately there is this, for most of us, I think, this intuition that kind of kicks in where you're like, oh, it's dark, it's quiet, it's late. Like, you really kind of get your back up and you're just more aware of your surroundings, right? But then there are other times where it's the middle of the day, there's plenty of people around and you don't have those sorts of feelings. But then you have these irrational feelings of where you're in a situation or a location where, for whatever reason, there's no reason for you to feel uncomfortable. It's not dark, or it's just a normal time of the evening, and yet somehow a feeling kicks in, and it's because there's someone around who has ill intention towards you.
In some of the stories I've got coming up, that's because there's a Bigfoot standing right behind you in the meat locker.
Well, that ties more into, like, is it infrasound or, what's going on there? But maybe, but this is why possibly, it's not the exact answer, but it's possible. This is why possibly some people are able to pick up on this. And then it goes even further to suggest, this is why you have mass hysterias, for example, or these contagions of hysterias that move through people, or fears or worries. It's because somehow those things are lighting up in our brains because there is a wireless transmission of that. What that is, we don't know yet, but it appears, pardon me, at least in macaque monkeys, that they have that ability. And they can apparently detect, like, when a monkey's going to swipe a banana from them or hit them. It was showing up in this research. So I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. So the question that Ingo Swann asked is, well, can this stuff be trained? Can we actually reactivate? Can we hone this kind of stuff? And it seems like, yeah, that seems to be the case. Particularly, there are anecdotal cases that show up in two circumstances: with explorers and during extreme sports. These people seem to have these abilities, but where it really seems to show up in the research that I was doing today, and I went and I dug out some old books. There's a book that we covered only recently called The Strange Science and True Stories of the Unseen Other. This is by Ben Alderson-Day. He did more of a, scientific, analytical approach, including the supernatural stuff, but as to why people have this feeling of a presence around them. A lot of his stuff kind of focused on things like epilepsy and Parkinson's and those sorts of more actual physical manifestations and these weird things that people get. But in there are anecdotes of people that seemingly have these invisible companions that get them out of difficult situations. And these aren't people that are suffering from any type of mental condition or physical, neurological condition. There was a South African doctor by the name of Paul Firth. He was in Argentina when he said that he felt a powerful sensation of being accompanied by someone while descending a mountain. He said it felt as if whatever it was actually causing his body, was floating, next to his body. This invisible companion kept on encouraging him to keep going. And he says as he got lower in the mountain and got out of danger and being in this snowy, extreme environment, he said the feeling just kind of dissipated. And as soon as he reached the bottom, it was gone. Now, this goes back to the earlier story from Ingo Swann. I'm thinking, well, is this some type of just innate ability of it? But I think there's more to it. And this is where the third man effect kind of ties in. And then, of course, you have a great deal of stories from mountaineers that describe things like they will go up into these difficult situations. There was a man that was on the Nanga Parbat in 1970. He was part of an expedition that sadly ended in tragedy. But while he was there, he claimed that there were phantom travelers that were holding the ropes along their journey and assisting them. You've got Smythe, who was on Everest in 1980. He also claimed to have said that there were figures that materialized out of blizzards. They came out of the hillsides, they came out of the glaciers, helped them along only to dissolve once again. There's also people claiming that when they're climbing and they're going up they're trying to find a footing or a holding, sometimes something will kind of push them. Not necessarily grab them, but push them to be able to grab hold of something to move, to go in a particular location, or to get themselves into situations that they might not necessarily be able to do themselves. And this is highlighted actually by a great anecdote of people in the third man effect that was highlighted by John Geiger. And I'll put the third man effect in the show notes. I mean, he's got a comprehensive collection of these sorts of stories. We know them well, so I won't go over it.
Geiger wrote 2 books, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, yes. I won't go over it in great detail because we've covered them. But one of the best anecdotes for this kind of stuff was, I believe it was a woman who was kayaking or canoeing. She fell into the water, into the rapids. And when she fell into the rapids, there was all these boulders around. And because of the force of the water, she couldn't get herself out. No matter how hard she tried, and she starts to panic because obviously she's drowning and her oxygen's getting low. And like the way I'm describing like this, it sounds like there's all this time, but this is happening in seconds, like in moments that this is occurring. But somehow some forceful hand reached down into the water, grabbed hold of her and reefed her out and pulled her up onto the bank. She kind of, flops over this boulder and is coughing up water and wants to immediately say thank you to a rescuer, thinking that it's just another kayaker. There's no one. There's no one around. There's no one for miles. Like there's no tracks. There's nothing. It's not like some guy just kind of came. And when she looks around, I recall that it was even difficult to get into that particular location in the first place.
Yeah, one of the favorites I remember, and I think it was from Geiger's books, and it's interesting that his first book was the third man factor, but his follow-up was the angel effect.
Yes, it very much ties into guardian angels. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he shifted a bit, but it was a guy who was basically drowning in the ocean. He had no chance of making it to shore. He was waving for help. He got caught in a rip or something. And he was about to go down until, as he's trying to tread water, he steps onto a platform. And it's just like this platform out in the middle of the ocean. And he doesn't know what it is. Is it a sandbank or something? He looks down. There's nothing there. He's just standing on this invisible platform. Eventually, the lifeguards come to rescue him. And when they grab him, it's like the platform disappears and he gets rescued.
Yeah.
There was never anything there. He was just able to stand on something so he wouldn't die.
And stories like that are just truly incredible because it's like, if you try to rationalize it, you can go, well, maybe in some circumstances, maybe there's just such a unique, it's such a random world and the entropy is just so high, this randomness that we have, that in some very highly unlikely way, because people win the lottery all the time, but your chances of winning the lottery are 1 in millions, but it happens all the time, right? That maybe there was a piece of like submerged crate or something.
Oh, please.
But you see what I mean? Like you see the leaps that you have to go through to be like, oh, that's how that happened. But then, there's enough of these stories that a guy can write 2 books about it. And it's not just him. There are a collection, and we go back to Steiger once again. Steiger has written about this as well.
Yeah. But I mean, that's why I'm mentioning how his perspective changed, because the third man effect, just the general language describes like some kind of physiological phenomenon.
Yes.
Or some kind of psychological effect. But once he researched enough of these stories, his follow-up, the angel
it's
effect.
Like
it's like, no, this is not some kind of physiological automation of the body kicking in. This is an external sentience. This is something looking out for you. This is something spiritual. This is something holy.
Yeah.
It's not just a random thing that happens to the human body. I find that argument so frustrating.
Well,
and it takes away all meaning from these experiences.
Yes.
It's like your life has almost come to an end, and in the grace of God, something has saved you, has shown you compassion and mercy. But the way some people look at this is, oh, isn't that weird that his body, like some chemical kicked in his brain and he walked off the mountain where he was surely going to die. It just takes away all the meaning from these experiences. That's why I find it frustrating.
Well, it does. Absolutely. I agree with you. And the reason why I say that is because It's like the physicality of these experiences is what gets me, right? So, people being kind of helped over to grab a rock ledge that they wouldn't be able to reach. I'm like, yeah, and people go, oh, well, they suddenly develop this superhuman strength and their limbs become more, bendable. I'm like, no, you don't just suddenly grow 6 inches in your wrist so that you can go reach up to something. Or, that's a small example. You don't have it that some huge dude reefs you out of a flowing torrent of water.
Do you remember the story of the rock climber? And he was on a sheer cliff face, and I think he was free climbing. And something shifted up ahead, and he looks up, and there's a giant boulder coming straight for his head. And again, I think this is from Geiger's book. It kind of stops in midair, shifts about 3 feet
like
over.
A Tetris block.
And then just drops straight past him. Like something moved it over for him.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he'd be killed.
Well, I'm pleased that you highlighted that, right? Because this is something that Steiger recognized, many decades ago. And it's like, I guess maybe John Geiger, because I don't know him, so maybe he hasn't, it wasn't even familiar with Brad Steiger's work and what he'd done. And Brad Steiger tended to actually very much lean more towards religious reasons for what was going on. I think a lot of that was influenced by Sherry Steiger because she was deeply, and still is, I believe, deeply religious. Not that there's anything wrong with that at all. But I think that's where I saw with John Geiger's book, it was very much like, hey, these are just the stories and here's what's going on. But then to have kind of this change to be like the guardian angel effect, I think even on some level, he must be realizing that there is something spiritual to going here. And this is what happened to Brad Steiger in the sense that Brad Steiger published a book that was like, I think it was Our Shadow World or something like that. I've got a copy somewhere here in the studio, and I did start pulling apart our endless boxes
don't
of
open
books.
The boxes, dude.
And
Number one rule, don't open the boxes.
I just gave up because there is a book there where I will find it one day and we'll go into the concept of spirit mimics. So Brad Steiger, when he published that book, he basically highlighted this collection of entities, right? Like he kind of very loosely categorize them. And it was kind of things like you would have deceased spirits. So these are people that were actually humans that have passed on and are still hanging around. Then you would have non-human spirits. So that kind of pops in with things like fae folk entities and elves and those sorts of things. And of course, I'm just paraphrasing here. I'm just giving you the kind of idea. Then he had also, like, I guess the demonic things came up as well. He had mimics, spirit mimics, and that's what I really want to look into. I couldn't find much detail about that. But spirit mimics, and I guess maybe Men in Black are an explanation for this. They look like us, they behave like us until some event happens that causes them to disappear. So an example would be there was a woman that was in her kitchen one day and she was doing the dishes, and as she's doing the dishes, her mother walks in behind her, and she doesn't look at her mother, but she knows, so she can feel the presence of her mother, and they're chatting away and they're talking and they're having a chat.
She turns around, it's Bigfoot.
No. What happens is that all of a sudden, and it's a large house, and the entrance to the house is down kind of towards the middle section of the house further down, and she hears the door swing open and the rattling of keys, and it's her mother going, "Dearie, I'm home." Right?
Vartiga, yeah.
And she spins around and her mother's not there. Now she goes running. She's like, "What trick are you playing? What are you doing?" And she's like, "What the hell are you?" She's like, "You were right there." She's like, "I promise you," this is her real mother, "I promise you that I was not in there. I've only just come home." So it's not even a Vartiga. It's like there was a spirit mimic pretending to be her mother standing behind her. And then the event that kind of broke it was that her mother walked through. Now, had someone else walked through, a father, brother, sister, would that have done the same thing? I don't necessarily know, because that seems to be what it is with spirit mimics. If you can get the entity or the entity mimicking the person that they're mimicking, then it will stop them from behaving. So I wanted to dig deeper into that. And there are more anecdotal stories online of people having experience, but they're far less.
It'd be interesting to know the content of the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there was no suggestion in there that there was any kind of guidance or anything like that. One example.
Make sure you divorce your husband.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I wondered, because even though this is why I need to read it, because I'm like, is he suggesting that spirit mimics are a dark and still, interference? Or is it that they're just... He does say, actually, in this very short blurb about them, that we don't understand their intentions.
Well, you would assume it's evil because it's a lie. It's a deception.
Well, you're right, but I don't necessarily know. So there was... it was. I'm going to play you some audio in a moment from Brad Steiger, who was speaking to the legendary Art Bell back in 1997. It's a 3-hour long.
3 hours of telephone audio.
It is. The audio is terrible. Like the audio, and we have, and even I couldn't clean it up with the AI that we have. I had to send it to Ben to his musical.
Musical?
Yeah, your musical fantasticness.
I ain't no musician. What's a musician?
And you
think I do magic tricks?
Well, pretty much. When it comes to audio, you absolutely do. Like, you really did clean it all up. But regardless of that, if you can persevere with it, he's actually got some really fascinating things, which I'll describe to you. But he was talking about, these ideas that we don't know the intentions of these particular things. Like, what could they be doing? But let's start off I need to go back to some of his experiences, because it's not just him. He himself had his own experience. And this experience, I should actually highlight his experience first, right? So it was an October night, 1940. He briefly talks about this in the audio, but he went into it in far greater detail in his book, The Shadow World of Unseen Presence, something like that. It'll be in the show notes. He's written so many books. But in there, he was describing this experience he had. He said he was just shy of his 5th birthday. And where they lived in this homestead of some kind. And in this homestead, it used to be the former stagecoach landing point, right? So I don't know if this is the early 1800s perhaps. And he said there was this kind of little river that was next to the house where obviously it would be a great place for the horses to go and have a drink. And but very peaceful. It was in Iowa, very happy upbringing he described. But he said that on just shy of his 5th birthday, the house was in this L-shaped configuration, and he's in his bedroom, and he could look out from his window and see over to the kitchen where his parents were. And he decided it was finally time to go to sleep, as little boys do, and he was fighting going to sleep. But he starts to go to sleep when he hears this unmistakable crunching sound that grabs his attention. Now, if it was anywhere else, he points out, you really wouldn't be too concerned about it, because there are people around. There could be people walking outside your home, obviously not close, but But he said because we were so far away from anything else, like we're talking miles. I'm not talking ultra miles, but miles. He said it was weird. I knew that there was someone outside, and he says not only does he hear this crunching of someone walking in the leaves, he then hears this like of something being dragged outside his house. And he looks he's like, I know that sound. That's a wash tub. It was like some wash tub, right, that they had just outside the house, but it was turned upside down. So he looks out.
It's not windy outside or anything.
It's not windy, and it's a heavy metal old stagecoach house stopping point tub. Like, it's big and it's heavy.
Someone's stealing it.
Well, he said that's what he thought. So he peers out the window, and as he peers out the window, he says he sees someone, or more to the point, something dragging this wash tub up to the window where his parents were in the kitchen. And it pushes this wash tub up to the window, and then it kind of climbs up on top of it and starts looking through the window. And he says, this thing, it looks strange. It's wearing a tight, almost form-fitting one-piece suit. It has a pointed hat. Its ears are also pointed. It's got long and slender fingers, and it's peering in through the window. Now, as he got older, and Steiger says that, and a lot of like ancestral stuff comes through here for Steiger, and I've been looking into this whole ancestral stuff recently. I think there's something really to it for people that have like I think we've all experienced this where we've been saved from difficult situations, or even in sometimes dangerous situations. And I've always thought, maybe I've got to go. I'm convinced now that there is some potential ancestral element to this kind of stuff. And I don't know if that's connected to just simply it's like a spiritual backup to our...
Well, it's like the story we covered last week with old Uncle Ponto, the eyewitness.
That's right.
The experiencer, in the end, we learned he was protected by his grandfather, who we had never met.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like these ancestral spiritual interventionists, I suppose, that seem to get people out of difficult situations. Well, he said that now from his...
So what is this thing? It's a creature? What is it?
Well, he says from his Scandinavian ancestry, he realizes that this is a Nisse, Nisse. He says it's a Scandinavian elf, and they're usually associated with the repair of machinery on farms. They bring a pail of water or perform some type of helpful nocturnal round. Now, he says he was only 7 or 8 feet away, roughly, from this creature, and he called this creature the Watcher. Like, this is just what he called it. I'm like, we were only just recently talking about the Watchers, and the Watchers in other contexts are not necessarily good. He said as he's watching this thing, though, it's almost like it knew that he was watching because it turned around, and as it turned around, he got this tingling sensation that was shot into him. And he said it came from the slanted reptilian-like eyes. Like this niece had these reptilian eyes. And he said it wasn't a hat that he was wearing. It was actually a misshapen head.
Oh.
Now, what he's describing here, he doesn't go into it. From what my interpretation is, he's basically describing a grey with reptilian eyes. And even like this one-piece form suit, I'm like, that's not traditional folkloric Scandinavian elves. This is something else. He says that he gets this jab of fear and his heart starts racing. And it was almost like he wasn't supposed to have seen this diminutive intruder. And it was startled and as upset as he is. But then the thing starts to kind of like send something into him. And he's like, calm down, calm down. And he says he was just looking into the eyes of this thing. He locked on and he's like, the eyes were obviously disproportionately too large for its face. Where have we heard that? But he says that it seemingly enchanted him. And then the next second, the more calm he became, it's morning. Like it's just the next morning. Time. Now, of course, he was so shocked by this that he runs to his parents and he tells his parents, and he says his parents actually indulge him in it, more so than you'd expect a child, back in those years. But he says now, 60 years later, this particular event in itself was what compelled him to pursue the supernatural 60 years later. Like, well, for those 60 years, like ever since then, he'd been pursuing it. And Steiger is now convinced that this thing is not an elf, like maybe there's a way to describe it, but it wasn't an alien either. He says this is a multi-dimensional being. And this goes into what we were only talking about before when we were saying, well, there's no actual form to these things. And this is what he starts talking about when he's talking to Art Bell. He's like, what you and I were saying, Ben, like other researchers have said this is an energy that kind of manifests and it represents itself, it kind of molds to the society. Steiger was very much convinced back in 1997 that whatever this is, I wrote it down here, is that it basically, these entities, they change, right? He's like, they're not ghosts, they're not aliens. We did have in the past, going back, he says 50,000 years. 50,000 years ago, we know it was 50,000 years ago of these concepts because there are cave paintings that even academics have interpreted of people describing there being spirit-like or ghost-like forms. And these cave paintings have been dated to 50,000 years. So these things have been around for a long time. And much like Ursula in her book was kind of hinting at, it's like, well, Brad Steiger says, is there any difficulty for these beings, these forms, these multidimensional beings to put on a spacesuit and go, hey, we're aliens, and start affecting people in exactly the same way? There's a different thing to do. Like, why they're doing it, we don't know. There's a different way of going about it, but it's still the same kind of thing. So going back to Steiger's experiences, he also describes that he's like, well, it's not just him. Here's this ancestral element. And of course, what comes up in ancestral elements, in certain phenomena, it's UFOs. We were just describing how UFOs or abductees seem to have a lifelong family kind of
follow
connection,
the bloodline.
Yeah, to these things. Well, it's same with spiritual encounters. So Brad Steiger says that his mother had encounters when she was young. I'll let him describe this scene where essentially his mother and her sister had witnessed what at first they took to be a ghost, but then it tended to be something even more terrifying.
Well, we have been linked up ever since I was a child. We have a strong telepathic connection. But as a child, I remember she was very mediumistic. It began for her when she was just a little girl, and an angel appeared before her older sister and herself. And the entity was solid enough, Art, that it left imprints of its sandals in the gravel road near the country home where they lived. The entity was dressed in a robe. It was glowing. It walked down the lane of their neighbor, or seemed to walk, and next thing they saw was the shadowy form of their neighbor walking with the angel, and the man died that night. So what they in essence saw was an angel of death coming to take a soul home.
Yeah, I mean, that's even more disturbing than just simply a ghost encounter they've seen. So, and in that instance, there's a form of veridical, there's an element to it because the guy died. So, of course, you could go, is it that, it's a young kid and they don't know how to deal with death, so this is the way it's manifested? But I don't think so. I think because his mother continued to have a lifetime of these experiences, and then so does he. And then what does he see? He sees some weird elf-like creature spying upon his parents when he's 5 years old. Now, this doesn't end. He also has this short anecdote of where his mother claimed something very similar to the 2 reports I told you earlier of these guardian spirits giving guidance. She had the same experience on a farm.
When the little lady would come and talk to her at night, then she would be able to tell Dad, you better get the crop in, you better do this because the storm is coming, whatever. And it was always the lady who told her. So I recognized that was, in essence, like a spirit guide.
So the spirit guide would come to his mother and guide her. And you hear these sorts of reports frequently, and you find them over and over again. So going back to Steiger, right, because these experiences, even though, we talk about them essentially in isolation, like there's one anecdote and the next anecdote and the next anecdote, and they're fascinating and intriguing. But it's actually to the person experiencing them. You find that it's not just an isolated experience, it's an ongoing lifetime of contact and phenomena. And then it starts moving into elements of high strangeness because it's not just that you have this one experience where you see an entity, something else down the track may happen that provides you with some weird, I wouldn't say it's a confirmation.
Yeah, well, that's the question. What does it provide you with?
Yeah, and that's...
What do you actually get out of this?
Actually, that's what Steiger said as well, because he said, like, for example, when entities we experience, like, for example, people experience entities as grandma, right? And we're only just talking about this with Ursula's work, was that people are dealing and grieving, right? And then all of a sudden, they want to get in contact with the person who's passed away and they'll pursue it. And then all of a sudden, grandma will show up or grandpa will show up in this form. And it turns out that it's not grandma or grandpa. It's some entity that's masquerading, right? Well, Steiger says, could these actually be these multi-dimensional entities that are posing as loved ones to make us more comfortable with interacting with them? And I'm like, yeah, that's one possibility. We obviously in that last episode went to, they're just demonic or they're behaving in a demonic fashion. But yeah, maybe that's one possibility. It's like the contact effect, right? They become, your father to pretend that they're doing something. But Steiger just briefly mentioned this line that grabbed my attention. He says there's a messaging that goes on that's not apparent or may not be apparent at the time. I'm like, okay, what's the message? Like, what are these things trying to, and he even hints at, he says, maybe there's some jealousy by these entities. And I'm like, yeah, and this is where you and I have headed before, that there is some jealousy of the human form, perhaps, the human spirituality that they want to get access to. And that's why they masquerade as ghosts, Bigfoots, werewolves, aliens. It's all part of the same thing, trying to get at humanity. And Art Bell, rightfully so, asked the question along the lines of like, well, then why do we have fear? Like, why are they creating fear? And it's like, well, it creates fear in a sense because it kind of makes you realize that you're still human. Like there's this human factor to it. But I thought as an extension of that, is that some type of, is it the entity generating it so it can feed on it? Or is it the entity doing it so that it confirms that you're not a spirit mimic? Because think about it, right? If you've got all these entities and they're all in competition, think about it. Like even if you break it down into a very fundamental kind of way, if they're still an organism of some kind, whether or not they're physical, it doesn't matter. They're still competing for limited resources, human beings. Well, would you generate fear or something so that you know that it's not a spirit mimic? Or something else. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too deep into it in this kind of stuff.
It just seems to be what occurs in a lot of the eyewitness reports.
So many, Ben. So many.
Especially with sleep paralysis. Like it's purposefully creating this fear and feeding off it.
There was a story I was reading from Brent Rains, I believe, and it was something along the lines of a woman who had seen a UFO, right? She'd seen a UFO, but hadn't had any experiences with an entity of any form or anything like that. But she'd gone to bed, I think it was that evening or the following evening, where she awoke to a classic shadow person, old hag experience, right? But it wasn't classic in the sense that this figure or this form, whatever it was like over the top of her, like sitting on her, pressuring her, but over the top of her, also drawing out her breath. It was like sucking her breath, no direct contact, but it was sucking her breath out, right? And when her breath was coming, it wasn't her breath. It was like some, I guess, life force or like Pardon me, is that what you could call it? But she managed to move, right? She managed to move and like break the spell of this thing and push it off. And the thing kind of tumbled off onto the floor and then took off out the window, right? But when it took off out the window, she goes and looks out the window and she says it like transformed into an owl, but it was an owl with bright red eyes.
Well, I've got at least 10 of these stories coming up in the Plus extension of these entities, whatever they are, shape-shifting from different forms.
Really?
Whether it's a giant snake, I've got a case of a giant snake, there's a fox, there's dwarves turning into panthers. There's a great story of 3 eyewitnesses see a yowie in New South Wales, which is like our version of Bigfoot. And they all see 3 different things. One eyewitness sees it go behind a tree and turn into a man wearing a blue jogging suit and start running away. The other eyewitness sees it turn into a goanna, a giant lizard. The other eyewitness just sees it disappear. Yeah.
See, that's consistent with what these researchers, including Brad, have been hinting at. It's like the phenomenon responds to each individual. Like individuals see separate things. A great example of that was actually highlighted by a story that was published in one of Brad Steiger's series. I don't have it directly in front of me, but you know how he did those series of Real Nightmares, right? He did those series, which were like 80 to 100-page books that just included all these little anecdotes. There was this one story that I'm just going to, paraphrase off the top of my head, where it was of a man and a woman, a couple that had been doing some shopping one day, and the guy was like, "Oh, I'm just going to go and grab some cigars or something from a tobacconist." And so she's like, "Yep, no worries." Their car is parked directly out the front of the tobacconist, right? And she's sitting in the car, and he walks in, and when he walks in, he says, he knows this tobacconist. He's been there plenty of times before, but he walks in and there's 5 people in front of him. But he said these 5 people in front of him were just weird. And by weird, he means is at first, like they were kind of squabbling with the shop assistant. Like they were kind of and he couldn't really get, like everything was slow. Everything became weird, right? But he said they were wearing like clothing that was like they were wearing clothing from the 40s, but then like white, like long leather boots from the 60s, like some like Twiggy, for example. Like he's like, none of this makes any sense. Like, why are they wearing? It's like they didn't know how to get dressed.
They look like Michael J. Fox when he goes back to the Wild West. He's wearing like a clown's outfit.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was like. And he's like, none of this makes any sense. And so even though he says they're all very pale, like they're all very pale, they're all very gaunt. There's just obviously something off about them. And the reason why they were fighting with the assistant is because she said they all looked young. Right? They're not super young, but they looked young enough that she had to ask for ID. And wherever this was, I can't recall, but apparently the state inspector or whatever you call it comes down really hard on people or business owners, if they sell tobacco to people that are too young. Yeah. And I get it. Like it's here in Australia, you've got to ask for ID for anyone that looks under 25. That's just what it is. So the same thing was happening there. And they all produced IDs, right? Now, they all claimed to be together from the same state. Well, they just all claimed to be together, but they produced each and every one had an ID from a different state. And this grabbed her attention. Like that was what really was agitating her as a business owner, because she's like, I could get fined. So where are you from? And they're all like, we are from New York. And she's like, but you've got one from, all these different states. Like, what's going on? And one of them was holding like this cigarette tin. And he was like, he wanted candy cigarettes. And she's like, we're a tobacconist. Like, they're not going to.
What is the point of this interaction?
Well, this is the thing. Like, no, it's all surreal, right? It's all strange. And he's there and he's like, oh, come on, this is taking forever. So they just buy their tobacco. Like, suddenly she gives them whatever they're buying. They don't know what to do with it.
So is the kicker of this story that they're just Americans?
No, not at all. Because what happens is that they go, and as they go, he didn't notice, right? He's like, they've each got large suitcases. Like they were all like kind of piled up against the door, but he didn't notice them when they went in. And he's like, all these suitcases, and all the suitcases, again, different sizes, different, types. Like some of them seem really old. So none of it makes sense. So they all leave, right? They finally leave. He walks up to the counter and says something along the lines of like, what the hell was with that? And she's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, but you just like, and she kind of like vaguely, like it kind of vaguely comes back. Like it's kind of like, oh, like, yeah. And so she did kind of have some recollection, but then she just sells him his cigars and he leaves. And he leaves. He gets into the car. His girlfriend is pissed. Like she's, where have you been? What's taking you so long? What's going on? And he's like, what are you talking about? So he thought he was only in there for minutes, right? He's been gone for God knows how long.
For days.
Like, not for days, but like long enough that she's super pissed, right? Like super pissed. And he's like, there were customers in there. He's like, didn't? She's like, no. She's like, I've been staring intently at that door. You went in. No one else came in. No one left. You were there, right? And he's like, what the hell? Now, what he says is that, hang on a second. And it's like, this kind of comes back to him. When he was talking to the shop assistant, they were looking out the window. When they looked at the way, they watched these 5 people, like men and women, walk out. They dematerialized in the street. So, and she saw it, right? But afterwards, she's like, no, what are you talking about? So it's like the experience is of the height of being surreal.
It's definitely heist to something.
Yeah, but there's no, and it's like, well, what is the purpose of these experiences? There's no reference to him seeing UFOs. There's no, like, because it feels like it's got a Men in Black feel, but it doesn't. It just has this strangeness of being messed with by the phenomena, but it really does highlight how each and every individual can be in the same reality, in the same vicinity, like what you just described of seeing a Bigfoot walking behind a tree, but then seeing different things. That's exactly what happened in this circumstance. It's like it somehow focused. Now you could go, well, is it just the one individual who's having a hallucination? But why would you have such a specific hallucination that's like that?
Well, it speaks to the manipulation of the eyewitness's mind, but beyond that, what can you say about it? Other than it's odd.
Then it's odd. And that's all we're left with, right? You're just left with, it's odd. It's like, why? Like, why are these things doing it? And it comes back to Steiger's idea of, look, these are multi-dimensional beings that are interacting with humanity for reasons that we cannot ascertain. Like, that's where we're at. So let's go back again to Steiger and the kind of the completion. Well, not the completion because it never really ends, but back to Steiger and his experience, right? So he says years later, we skip forward to 1987, like many decades later, he's attending this art show of Luis Romero in Sedona. And he says he's walking around this art gallery and there's all these paintings and it's all of like supernatural art, I suppose you could say. And he stops because he says he comes face to face with this facsimile of the entity from his childhood encounter. Now, the experience with this niece, it's, even though I was saying before, it's got the feeling of a grey, it's so unique though, that it's not a grey. Like, it's not just he's come around the corner and he's seen a painting of a grey, which is already, even in 1987, is out there in the zeitgeist. It's like, it's that creature. Like the niece, it's that creature. So he's like, he knows Lewis and he's like, this must be because I told Lewis this story. He's like, I told him this story. So he must have, painted this. And so he goes over to him. He's like, oh, I love how you've done this recreation. He's like, I didn't paint that. And he says, he's like, who painted it? And he's like, oh, this woman. And he described her. And he's like, did you tell her the story? He's like, no, why would I tell her the story? Like, he was like, just like natural about it that it was like, he was clear he wasn't making it up. It's like, why? Like, why would I tell this random artist in town about your story from when you're 5 years old? It just doesn't make any sense. So Brad's like, oh, okay, that's a weird coincidence, right? Surely it's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. He meets this woman, right, in Sedona. And Sedona is already a weird place. We know that. Like, it's got a little weirdness attached to it, but it's still really cool. And he meets her and he's like, hey, so that creature that you painted, is that like out of your memory or whatever? She's like, no. She's like, I had this experience where, when I was a kid, I heard something walking around the house and I looked out the window and it was right there. I actually saw it. And he's like, what do you mean you saw it? I saw it. Like, I saw it. I saw that creature when I was a kid. So let's get talking more. She also lived on a farmhouse that was in the town neighboring his town.
Oh, wow.
When they were kids.
Wow.
So this creature, right, was the same creature. It's obvious,
just
like in the same vicinity.
It's got a lair somewhere nearby.
Yeah, it's like it's only a matter of a few miles. He said the family farms were in neighboring small towns. They talked and were shocked to hear the stunning parallels of their experiences. And guess what as well? Her name was Sharon, right? Contact with this entity had changed Sharon's life so much like it had changed his life. In different ways, but had set them off on this kind of thing. So Brad writes that he's since met many people that have claimed to have encounters with very similar beings. Like, not greys, these niece type beings that are
you're the one that's saying it's a grey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like for me, it has the indication of a grey. But like, he's like, no. Like, they've got like pointed heads and pointed ears and very much elfish kind of form. And he's like, this particular subset of being, many people have seen them. And in a way, it's almost like these people are a group of contactees in their own club. It's like they're contactees with this particular entity. And each and every one of them has said for some unknown reason, their life has been forever changed. They've undergone some type of mystical experience that was illuminating, but also unifying as much as the human psyche can possibly perceive or possibly comprehend. So these individuals have now been inducted by this supernatural force to find ways to utilize these supernatural energies to create any number of phenomena, including what they claim are miraculous healings, levitations, mind over matter abilities, communications with spiritual intelligences on other planes of existences, all those sorts of things.
So you're saying the people that have encounters with these entities are doing those things?
They've been inducted by these things, and all of them have had encounters with these things when they're much younger. And of course, there are individuals that, claim that now having been inducted by this supernatural force, they can utilize these energies to create the phenomena, right, themselves. And so a collection of these beings stand out as being remarkably unusual. But he then comes back to the spirit mimics. He's like, yeah, look, there are these spirit mimics. These are strange in-between beings that often pose as ordinary men and women until some peculiar or out-of-place action causes them to have a response that gives them away.
So you're saying that's what perhaps these weird people in the
these niece things,
or the tobacconist were?
Yeah, these beings, right? They they appear in different forms, right? And when we say that we don't know what their, from a human perspective, we don't know what their goals are. We can't ascertain what they're trying to achieve. When you hear stories about this, of many people having these initiatory experiences and then having supernatural abilities that seemingly are helpful, it suggests that maybe these beings are trying to seed some type of supernatural or spiritual knowledge to people, but without being detected. And that's the more positive kind of spin on this, is that it's not all demonic, it's not all demons, it's not all bad things. It's like they're giving a message, they're relaying some type of spiritual information.
What is spiritual about it, though?
Well, because it's like healings, for example. Like it's helping people to heal themselves. It's mind over matter. It's communication with other spiritual intelligences on other planes of existence that offer knowledge and information that can guide humanity, that can raise humanity up. It's all very new age when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing to me just sounds like extrasensory abilities.
Yes, right. But for these people claim that these extrasensory abilities, these supernatural abilities that they have attained, they use to assist other people. And I'm like, there's a
with
positive
what,
spin on
though?
it. Well, I don't know. It doesn't say what they are.
See, for me, it's like it's spiritual content is moral in nature. And if it doesn't have that, then it's not spiritual content. It's just something else.
Well, I mean,
it's like these people, you're saying they're being taught all these abilities, but the question is to what end? And the better question is, well, why is that spiritual? Like, why is it spiritual to be able to talk to other entities?
That's far too complex to dive into now, but I see where you're going.
Like, why is it spiritual to be able to heal someone? It's not necessarily spiritual. It's just, that just sounds like an ability. It's like,
it's an ability.
It's like learning to play tennis.
Well, maybe you're getting caught up on the word spiritual, right? But it's
an important distinction because, I mean, spiritual to me means you're learning something of a high moral nature.
Well, yes. Much of this, for some of these people and their claims that they're making, it is for the, I guess, what's the word for it?
It's not like, it's
for the benefit of other people.
To use the obvious example, it's not like Jesus came and left all these instructions to walk on water and heal the sick and do all these different things. It's like there was moral instructions. There was moral spiritual instructions.
But he did that. Well, this is what we don't know, right? So when Steiger's saying there seems to be this messaging that goes on that is not apparent at the time, is that part of it? Are they somehow sending a moral message through to people?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the issue. If we don't have the content of the message, how can we evaluate it?
Well, we don't. Well, okay, so that's where we can go into this on another show.
And it's a big assumption for Steiger to say it's of a spiritual nature. I mean, yeah, it may be of a spiritual nature, but
well, you have to recall.
Is it good though? I mean, is it good for someone to have this encounter and then be having psychic connections with other entities and going around healing people?
See, in light of other shows, that's why I tried to make this much lighter and more positive, because where you're going right now is like, it's all demons, Like it's kind of like I see what you're saying. Like, yeah, it's all low level entities, and you know what? I don't know.
And you could also say, well, if they had never had that run in with this weird elf creature, would their life be more orthodox? Like, would they have gone to the local church? Would they have a different spiritual relationship? Like, would they have a different spiritual path? Because that's often some of the criticism with this activity is that it leads people away from a traditional orthodox spiritual path, right? And they get drawn into the murky occult world. I mean, this is what we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes.
Yeah, but people can also, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you see it all the time of where people that claim to be, you know, like in orthodoxy and religious becoming so salacious that it's just like insanity and they go too far off that deep end as well. So I don't necessarily, I see what you're saying, and I think we've highlighted this in many cases of that, yeah, people are taken, I guess, they're absconded by these entities. But the difference in those cases is that they're told, and this was the factor that came up with Ursula, is that they're told that they're special, they're told that they're saving the world, that these sorts of people don't seem to be that. It seems to be like they're spreading this knowledge amongst people, but it's more of it's not benign. But it's more of a way to possibly maintain some goodness.
We can't make the distinction though because we don't know what it is.
Well, guess what happens?
We don't know what the message is. Well, we don't know what's actually being spread.
We know what the message is because only recently I was describing how one of Brad Steiger's first books was not written by him. It was written by some entity that came through him and fired up his computer and wrote everything for him. So it's like,
and what was the content of that?
That was the divine revelation, and that actually had a spiritual spin on it. About
right.
I know I haven't read it actually. I should read it to see where.
And
he's
let me
going
guess,
with that.
the revelation is that everything we know about the religion is wrong. And
I doubt that because I found some of Steiger's later books, and because Sherry being very religious, I've never seen his work to be like you should use this to guide you away from that. Like and a lot of his work actually comes back to, yes, there are, and I think, you know, you're possible, and maybe it's the way I presented it that we're being a bit unfair to Brad because really I think from what his work is, it's very much, yes, there are angels and there are good spiritual beings that are helping humanity, but there are also very dark, terrible beings that are trying to get at humanity.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward.
So yeah, it's really like, if you want to be that reductive about it, that's really what it is. Like it really comes down to good versus evil. And I think with Brad Steiger, he was very convinced that it is. And I actually feel like in some of his work, particularly in his later books, like Otherworldly Beings, for example, you know, the one with the blue cover, it was very much like it's all angels.
And if it wasn't for some hideously ugly, disgusting elf creature that lives in a disgusting golem cave nearby, they wouldn't have come to those conclusions.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So, but this is the thing, like, are some people induced to see these things? I mean, that's what I was thinking about it today. Is like, is that what this is? When people have these experiences, it's induced to see them so that they can reveal the dangers of them to the rest of the world. And that's what Brad Steiger does. Like when you read his work, you can see that there are inherent dangers in messing with this stuff, which is something that you and I know it's like flogging a dead horse, I know. But, you know, like I've just seen too much of people truly being damaged and destroyed by this.
What's the last bit of audio?
So the last bit of audio that I just want, it's just an anecdotal story, right, that he describes. But he says, look, let's talk about those mimics, right? A really great example is he was talking about the evolution of his experiences. And he said that he thought that possibly it's like what we talk about stone tape theory or residual hauntings. It's like a TV, for example. You can have a TV playing in your house, and no matter how much you yell at it or tell it off, or even right now you're screaming at me, I'm not going to respond to you. Like it's just a recording. That's all it's going to have. It's the same with these hauntings, right? These hauntings are just some terrible event takes place. It impregnates itself into the fabric and the material of the space that it's in, and then it just repeats over and over and over and over. But he said there was this one experience he had where it was like the residual haunting somehow took on his form, and one of these spirit mimics seemingly came through, and it was because they were staying in this hotel, he and Sherry. And Sherry woke up in the middle of the night to see what she thought was Brad pacing around the room and then kind of hanging his head on like in despair by sitting in a chair. I'll let him describe what happened, and we'll talk about it.
She saw me clearly sitting in first pacing. She watched me pacing the room, or so she thought it was I. Pacing the room, and then sitting in the chair and putting my head in my hands and shaking my head like I was just really upset. And then she realized it was not I. So she described it to me, and she says, oh, what an eerie feeling, I'm talking to you across the room, and then I feel you beside me.
Yes.
And this was in the original bed. It was a huge thing, so stuffed. That's something I would not normally sleep in. So later in the evening then, or in the night, we went back to sleep, and then Sherry feels first it's my hand reaching over and taking hers. And she feels this hand, and then it feels this hand, and first she thinks, that I'm reaching over, and then she realizes that's not my hand. It's a little hand.
A little hand.
And then she sees it glowing is this hand and arm, the forearm and arm of a baby, and of an infant.
What?
That was the room in which the baby died. The husband and wife were distressed. The husband was pacing off. He reached out finally and touched his mother's hand for consolation and then died.
Oh.
So many people had reported seeing the man pacing and then feeling and having touched and having the baby's hand reach out and touched it. Now, you see, if we had known that first, do you see what I'm saying?
Of course, it would have been a total contamination.
Right.
Ghost babies or stone tape?
Well, it's a very tragic story, but it's consistent with what you'd expect for a residual haunting, right? But this was a little bit different in the sense that the pacing father took on the form of Brad. So this starts tying back into these other, subcategory of spirits. But one thing I want to highlight, right, which I didn't get to before, and it's actually a good way to finish this. I'll link to all of this in the show notes. I'll link to these books from Brad. I'll link to that full Art Bell interview. There's plenty more. I'll link to the Ingo Swann presentation where he goes into more of the scientific side of this kind of stuff as well that differs from what we were talking about, but great stuff. When Brad wrote his first book on Shadow World, as I was saying, he had all those categories, right, of entities that people experience. When he wrote the second book, which I've pulled from today, where he's describing some of these experiences, he added a category, right? This is after he's had an evolution in his experiences. Well, guess what that additional category was? Angels.
Oh.
So he'd had enough of these experiences to be convinced this was angels. Now, I don't want to be so simplistic to say, well, all of Ursula's stuff where we're saying it's all demons, and Brad Steiger's like, it's all angels. But he does, as I highlighted just before, he does identify that, look, there is, and this is the spiritual side of it, they are angelic in the orthodox sense beings that do want the best for humanity and are trying to guide humanity in the right way. So look, it's not all dark, it's not all terrible, and there are good things out there even in this supernatural world.
Well, we've discussed this before on the show as to why there's less angel stories, why those positive stories are harder to come by. And it's because I think the influence that you gain from something that's of a higher spiritual nature isn't so obvious and overt.
No, and it's more personal as well.
Yeah, and it's something that you have to realize yourself or enlighten to. So it comes in the forms of
it's passive.
Of hints or
yes.
maybe you might an experience or a synchronicity that allows you to realize something important, to awaken to something important, to enlighten to a principle or something. Whereas the demonic side of things is very overt, very direct. It interferes, it manipulates. It does through deception and dark means. So it's a clear distinction between the two.
And it wants attention, whereas I don't think the angel experiences want attention. That's where you can find the difference between them.
There is a gray area in the middle, though, which is giant talking cats and perverts.
That's definitely a gray area.
Which is coming up in our plus... my voice is gone.
I even like the subtitle, The Giant Talking Cat and the Pervert. We need to actually frame that. We need to get that printed up in a poster and then put that on the wall somewhere.
This is all coming from Richard Freeman's brand new book, The Highest Strangeness. And I've got another one here. It's this... If you're listening to the audio, it's a young girl being freaked out by a giant neon luminous
crab.
No, ghost crab. It's a ghost crab in her room.
So what subcategory of Brad Steiger entities would that fall into?
Just general South African weirdness. It's from South Africa. So yeah, great stuff coming up. I'm looking forward to telling you some of these stories. This is from The Highest Strangeness by Richard Freeman. A lot of crossover with what you've been talking about.
Excellent.
Especially with entities shape-shifting and what their true designs are on the people they're interacting with. To get access to that, head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Sign up to our Plus extension. Sign up to our Plus membership. It gives you these extensions every single Friday. And of course, you get an exclusive show on Tuesday as well. These extensions we do at the end of these free shows, they're not like 10, 15 minutes. It's like a whole other show after we've done our original hour and a bit every Friday. And of course, the Tuesday show is like usually an hour and a half or longer as well. So tons more content if you sign up for our Plus membership. You also get a high quality audio version of the show, totally ad-free version of the show, and all the videos are on our website at mysteriousuniverse.org as well. Just go to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Sign up today. And of course, if you sign up for the MU Max tier, you get access to our massive back catalogue going back nearly 2 decades now. Again, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Help support your favorite show. That's a wrap for this free edition of MU. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week.